The chamber was built to make you feel small. That was not an accident. The Galactic Sovereignty Council had spent 6,000 years perfecting the art of making others feel small. The ceiling rose 40 feet above the speaker's floor. The council seats curved upward in 7 wide tiers. 47 species looking down from above, like a mountain looking down at a stone. Every species that had ever stood on that floor and looked up had understood, without being told exactly what they were. Small, temporary, outnumbered. The human envoy looked up, then he looked back down at his notepad. He wrote something. Senior Arbiter Serath Vo, 400 years old, dissolver of 17 civilizations, watched this from his seat in the 3rd tier and felt something he could not name move through him like a cold draft through a sealed room. His name was Marcus Yellen, 38 years old, a mid-ranking diplomat from the Earth Foreign Affairs Division. Not their best man, not their worst. The kind of man that bureaucracies produced in large numbers. Competent, quiet, difficult to read. He had arrived on time. He had brought no assistance. He carried one notepad, a pen that looked like it cost nothing, and an expression that suggested he had been to rooms like this before and found them less impressive the second time. Serath Vo had reviewed the file. Yellen had no military background, no intelligence history. His record was clean in the way records got when someone was very careful or very boring. And Serath Vo had stopped believing in very boring a long time ago. The chamber settled into its formal silence. All 47 species present. The air had that particular weight it always carried before a pronouncement, thick with the awareness that what was about to be said would matter, would be recorded, would outlive most of the people in the room. Serath Vo rose. He read the ultimatum. It had 17 points. It was beautifully written. 400 years of diplomatic craft went into its construction. Firm without being cruel, specific without being petty, final without sounding emotional. Point 1 covered trade restrictions. Points 2 through 6 covered military tonnage limitations. Points 7 through 11 covered the dismantling of what the Council officially called Earth's unsanctioned outer belt installations. Points 12 through 17 covered the compliance framework, the verification process, and the consequences of non-compliance. The compliance window was 90 standard days. The language was elegant. The meaning was simple. Bend. Or we will bend you, Serath Vo finished. He sat. The chamber waited for the expected response. The protest, the grief, the negotiation, the display of emotion that the Soilborns were so famous for. They named their ships after dead leaders. They sent music into space with their first probe. They cried in council chambers. They were, the council had long agreed, a deeply feeling species, and deeply feeling species were manageable species. Yellen looked up from his notepad. Which 90-day window? The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of a room full of very intelligent beings, all arriving at the same question at the same moment. Serath Vo kept his voice level. And the document specifies a standard compliance period beginning from, because this is the 3rd ultimatum you've sent Earth in 60 years, Yellen said. He tapped his notepad once. I wanted to make sure we were counting the same one. The chamber did not make a sound. Serath Vo had sat in this chamber for 300 years. He had heard silences of every kind. Angry silences, frightened silences, the profound silence that followed the dissolution of a civilization that had once controlled 14 systems. He knew what each kind felt like in his chest. This one he had never felt before. He had prepared for anger, for grief, for the elevated voice, the shaking hand, the dramatic pause before a threat the Soilborns couldn't back up. He had not prepared for a man who treated the 3rd ultimatum the same way you treated a 3rd reminder from your tax office. As an administrative matter, as a thing to file correctly. Yellen was writing again. Earth will respond in writing within the standard period, he said without looking up. Through the official channel, we appreciate the council's time. He stood. He gathered his notepad. He walked off the speaker's floor, unhurried, shoulders loose, not performing calm, just wearing it. In the 2nd tier, 2 seats from the left, Councillor Dresch watched him go. Dresch was 80 years old, which made him the youngest member of the council and the one most often asked to stay quiet in situations that required experience. His species, the Veld, lived for 300 years and believed strongly that wisdom came with age. Dresch had spent his entire political career being told to wait his turn. He watched Marcus Yellen walk through the exit doors. He put his hand in his pocket and touched the pen. He had bought it at a human market stall on the colony station Vela 9 2 years ago during a routine diplomatic transit. The vendor, a woman with gray in her hair and engine grease on her hands, had been selling pens, tools, and what appeared to be hand-stitched maps of star systems that didn't exist. When Dresch had picked up the pen, she had laughed. Not at him, not unkindly. She had laughed the way people laughed when something struck them as quietly funny in a way that wasn't quite explainable. "A pen," she'd said. "Good choice. That'll last longer than most things." He had not understood the joke. He had bought the pen anyway. He kept it in his pocket because he had not yet figured out what else to do with it, and he was the kind of person who kept things he didn't yet understand until he understood them. He understood now, sitting in the second tier, while the rest of the council began talking in low voices about compliance modeling and projected response timelines, that the joke was not about the pen. He didn't know what it was about. He knew it was relevant. Sarath Vo did not sleep well that night. This was unusual. He had announced 17 civilizational dissolutions in his career. He had delivered terms to species that wept, species that raged, species that collapsed at the speaker's floor in visible grief. He had watched the light go out of worlds and filed the paperwork the next morning. He had a clean conscience and a full night's sleep every night for 400 years, and he considered this evidence that he was doing the job correctly. He lay in his quarters on the council station and stared at the ceiling and thought about Marcus Yellen's notepad. What was he writing? Not a diplomatic protest. You did not write a protest in the same room where the ultimatum was being read. You drafted it later, formally with witnesses and language review and 3 signatures. Yellen had been writing during the reading, during the pauses between points, in the margins perhaps, casual notes, the kind of notes you took when someone was telling you something you already knew. He got up at 2 in the morning and pulled Yellen's file again. He read it cover to cover for the second time. Clean record, no military background, 12 years in the Foreign Affairs Division. Before that, 4 years at the Earth Colonial Administration Office. Before that, 2 years as a logistics coordinator on the outer belt installations near the asteroid fields. Sarath Vo stopped. He read that line again. Outer belt installations. He cross-referenced it against the installation records in the Council's survey database. Standard mining and processing stations. The Council had flagged them 5 years ago as potential military conversion risks and included their dismantling in point 8 of the ultimatum. Nothing unusual in the survey data. Small facilities, old equipment, low output. He put the file down. He was being paranoid. He was 400 years old and he was being paranoid because a human diplomat had asked a procedural question in a calm voice and written things in a notepad. He went back to bed. He did not sleep. 3 days after the council session, Councillor Dresch received a report on his desk. It was from the Council's Intelligence Monitoring Division, which tracked communication patterns between Earth and its colonial networks. Routine surveillance, the kind of report that arrived every week and said, in essence, nothing to report. This one was different. The communication volume between Earth and the outer belt installations had dropped to almost nothing in the 6 weeks before the council session. Not because communication had stopped, because it had moved. The monitoring division had found traces, very faint, very careful traces, the kind that took an analyst 3 weeks to notice, of a different communication channel. Encrypted at a level the council's systems rated as sophisticated but not alarming. Earth used several encryption standards in different divisions. This one was labeled in Earth's own administrative filing system under a category called contingency logistics. Dresch read the report twice. Then he read it a third time. Then he went to find Sarath Vo. He found him in the senior arbitration office, standing at the window looking out at the stars, which was a thing that Sarath Vo never did. In 400 years of political life, Sarath Vo had looked out windows with purpose, at approaching ships, at new planetary arrivals, at things worth examining. He did not look at stars for the sake of looking. They knew, Dresch said. He set the report on the desk. He did not sit down. His legs felt strange. Sarath Vo did not turn from the window. The Soilborns processed these announcements differently than... They knew we were sending the ultimatum. Dresch kept his voice even. It cost him something. They knew 6 weeks before the session, maybe longer. The communication shift started before we had finalized the document language. Sarath Vo turned. That's not... The outer belt installations. Dresch pointed at the report. The communication went quiet because they weren't using the installations to coordinate anymore. They moved whatever they were doing to a channel we weren't watching. He stopped. He breathed. And they filed the move under contingency logistics. The word hung in the room. Contingency, not response, not reaction, not emergency protocol. Contingency, a thing planned for in advance, a category that existed before the event it was designed to address. Sarath Vo looked at the report. His face did the thing that happened to very old diplomatic faces when they encountered something they had not prepared for. It went very still in a way that looked like calm, but was not. One anomalous communication pattern, he said. That does not... How did they know? Sarath Vo did not answer. We finalized the decision to issue the ultimatum in a closed session, Dresch said. 47 species in that room. No external parties. The document didn't leave council security until it was transmitted. He picked up the report. They knew 6 weeks before the transmission. The office was quiet. Here through the window the stars sat where they had always sat, enormous and indifferent. It could be standard precautionary monitoring, Sarath Vo said. Their intelligence services could read a closed council session, Dresch asked. He was not aggressive. He was not angry. He asked it the way you asked a question when you already knew the answer was not going to make you feel better, but you needed to hear it said out loud. Sarath Vo had no answer. Dresch put the report back on the desk. He turned to leave. The pen fell out of his pocket. It hit the floor and rolled toward the window, catching the light. A small, cheap, human-made thing that cost almost nothing and apparently lasted longer than most things. He picked it up. He left without saying anything else. Sarath Vo stood in his office for a long time after that, looking at the place on the floor where the pen had been, and thinking about a market stall on Vela 9, and thinking about a woman with engine grease on her hands who laughed at something that wasn't quite explainable. He thought about Marcus Yellen's notepad. He thought, what was he writing? And this time the question felt less like curiosity. It felt like the first correct question he had asked in a very long time, arriving about 60 years too late. The ship was called the M.V. Harriet Tubman. It was not a warship. It had no weapons. It had no armor plating beyond the standard grade that kept micrometeorites from punching through the hull. It was a generation transport, third of its class, built in the orbital yards above Earth's moon, designed to carry people across long distances at moderate speed with reasonable comfort. It ran the Kepler 442 resettlement corridor twice a year, carrying families and workers and the kind of people who moved across the galaxy, not because they wanted adventure, but because there was work on the other end. 4,211 people. The Council's War Committee had chosen it with care. Sarath Vo had sat in that meeting and listened to the strategy. Not a warship. Striking a warship was a declaration of conflict, and conflict had rules, and rules created frameworks, and frameworks reduced options. Strike a civilian vessel, and the message became something else entirely. Something larger. Something that landed in the chest rather than the mind. You do not demonstrate force against soldiers. Soldiers fight back. You demonstrate force against what a civilization loves, and then you watch what breaks. The strike was clean, fast. The Harriet Tubman did not send a distress signal in time. The debris field spread across 250,000 kilometers of the Kepler corridor and then went still. The burst transmission reached Earth in 11 hours. Sarath Vo sat in his office and watched the clock. He expected the grief cycle to begin within 24 hours. He had seen it many times. The broadcast speeches, the emotional addresses, the flags at half measure, the loud and public process of a civilization working through its pain in full view of those who caused it. Emotional species did this. They externalized. They performed their grief because grief for them was a communal thing that had to be shared to be survived. He expected protests. He expected the diplomatic channel to fill with urgent messages. He expected Marcus Yellen, or someone very much like him, to arrive on the council station with red eyes and shaking hands, ready to discuss modified terms. The diplomatic channel stayed quiet. 24 hours, 48, 72. Earth said nothing. Not grieving quiet. Sarath knew grieving quiet. Grieving quiet had a texture. You could feel the presence of pain through the silence, like heat through a wall. This was different. This was the quiet of people with their heads down, working. Councillor Dresch received the secondary intelligence report on the morning of the fourth day. He was eating breakfast when it arrived on his terminal. He read the first 3 lines, put down his cup, and read it again from the beginning. For the outer belt installations, points 7 through 11 of the ultimatum, the structures the council had demanded be dismantled as a condition of the compliance framework, had been dismantled 6 months ago. The survey drones the council had tasked with monitoring the installations had logged the dismantling in real time, frame by frame. The structures had come down in an orderly sequence over a period of 11 days. The survey data had been filed, reviewed, marked as compliant, and archived. Dresch had personally reviewed that survey data 3 months ago. He set the report down, he picked it up. He read the relevant section a 3rd time, because sometimes things change between the 2nd and 3rd reading. They did not change. The installations had been dismantled 6 months ago. And then, according to the new intelligence report, compiled from a combination of thermal imaging, gravitational microshift data, and a very bored analyst who had been staring at the same sector of space for 6 weeks and noticed something that wasn't quite right. They had been rebuilt, not in the same place, deeper. Inside the asteroid belt itself, using the rock as cover, using the irregular gravitational signatures of the belt to hide the thermal output. Not on the surface of anything. Not attached to any structure the council survey drones were tasked with watching. Inside the rock. The analyst's note at the bottom of the report said, "This appears to have begun approximately 14 months ago, prior to dismantling." Dresch read that sentence 4 times, prior to dismantling. They had started building the new ones before they took down the old ones. He pushed his breakfast aside. He went to find Sarath Vo. Sarath Vo did not react the way Dresch expected. He had expected denial. He had expected the older man's 400 years of settled certainty to push back against the report's implications. He had expected the careful, measured voice that had managed 17 civilizations to find a reasonable explanation. Instead, Sarath Vo read the report in silence, set it on his desk, and said, 14 months. Yes, 14 months ago. Sarath Vo's voice was flat. We finalized the decision to issue the ultimatum 16 months ago, in closed session. Dresch stood very still. They started rebuilding 2 months after we decided to send the ultimatum, Sarath Vo said. 2 months after a closed council session that no external party should have had access to. The room had the quality of rooms where very bad realizations arrived. Too much air, too much light, the ordinary furniture of a working office suddenly looking strange and irrelevant. It is possible, Sarath Vo said carefully, that they began the rebuilding for unrelated reasons. That the timing is... They named the new installations, Dresch said. Sarath Vo looked at him. The analyst found a filing reference. In Earth's Colonial Administration records, the new installation network is logged under a project name. Dresch picked up the report and read aloud. Project Groundwork, Phase 2. The word Phase 2 sat between them. Phase 1, Dresch said, is logged as beginning approximately 60 years ago. Around the time of the first ultimatum. Sarath Vo did not speak. There is no Phase 3 listed, Dresch said, but there is a folder. He set the report down. It is empty. It was created 2 months after your closed session. It has a name. He waited. What is its name? Sarath Vo asked. If needed. On an undisclosed station at the outer edge of the Kepler corridor, Admiral Yara Osi received the confirmation of the Harriet Tubman's destruction at 0340 hours. She was already awake. She was always already awake at 0340 hours. She had stopped sleeping through nights sometime in her early 40s, when the distinction between work and not work had become too blurry to maintain, and had since reorganized her schedule around 4-hour blocks that she thought of not as sleep and waking, but as offline and online. Her staff had adapted. Her staff were very good. The officer who brought the confirmation, a young man named Reyes, 26, who had transferred to her command 8 months ago and still occasionally forgot not to knock before entering, set the report on her desk and stood at the edge of the room in the particular posture of junior officers delivering news they expected to be hard. She read it. She looked at the star map on the wall above her desk. It was large, 2 meters wide, real-time updated, showing the Kepler corridor in detail and the wider approach lanes in rough outline. The Harriet Tubman's last log position was marked automatically by the tracking system. A small point of light that had now gone still. 4,211 people. She had written down their names. All of them. It had taken her 2.5 hours 2 weeks ago when she had first calculated the probability that the council would choose the Tubman. She had written them down in her own handwriting in a small book she kept in the left drawer of her desk, and she had not opened that drawer since. She did not open it now. She looked at the map. She said, "Let them think that worked." Reyes, who was 26 and very good and still learning, said nothing because something in the Admiral's voice told him that this was not a statement that wanted a response. She was already writing. The thing nobody in the council had fully accounted for was the difference between grief and accounting. Is every civilization grieved? That was not the question. The question was what a civilization did with its grief, whether it wore the pain outwardly as a wound or filed it inwardly as a debt. Earth, it turned out, kept very careful books. The Harriet Tubman had been running the Kepler corridor for 11 years. It had made the transit 42 times. The crew knew the route the way you knew the walk from your front door to your kitchen. Without looking, without thinking, just the body knowing where it was going. The families aboard were not soldiers. They were not strategic assets. They were people with bags and children and jobs waiting on the other end. The council had destroyed them to send a message. Earth received the message, logged it, filed it in the left drawer, and went back to work. The intelligence network that Dresch's analyst had begun to uncover was not built in response to the Harriet Tubman. It was not built in response to the third ultimatum, or the second, or the first. It was built the way infrastructure was built, piece by piece over decades, by people who had looked at the kind of galaxy humanity had walked into and decided, without drama and without announcement, that the sensible thing to do was to be ready. Project Groundwork. Phase 1 had begun 61 years ago. A mid-level colonial administration official named Arjun Mehta, long dead, had written the initial proposal in 3 pages of plain language. The filing was archived under administrative logistics. The language was deliberately boring. The word military appeared nowhere in it. The word contingency appeared once, are in the 7th paragraph in a subordinate clause. The proposal had been approved by a committee of 5 people, none of whom held titles that suggested they had the authority to approve something that significant. This was also not an accident. By the time the council issued the first ultimatum, Phase 1 had been running for a year. By the time they issued the second, Phase 2 had been approved. The folder called If Needed had been created by a woman named Dr. Fatima al-Rashid, who worked in the Colonial Administration's Logistics Division and had a reputation for filing things slightly ahead of when they were needed. Her colleagues found this efficient. Her filing system was extremely well organized. She used color-coded folders and named them clearly, which was why the analyst on Dresch's intelligence team had been able to find the reference at all. Dr. al-Rashid had retired 4 years ago. She grew tomatoes on a small property outside of Lagos. She did not discuss her work with anyone. She slept very well. The third intelligence briefing arrived on Sareth Vaux's desk 8 days after the Harriet Tubman. He had asked his analysis team to go back through 60 years of Earth observation records and look for anything that had been categorized as administrative or logistical, rather than military or strategic. The resulting document was 900 pages long. He read the executive summary. Then he put it down. The outer belt installations were not weapons platforms. The council had assumed they were weapons platforms, had built the entire military section of the ultimatum around the assumption that they were weapons platforms, because what else would a civilization build in an asteroid belt, out of sight, over 14 months? They were manufacturing nodes, not for weapons, for components. the kind of components that could be assembled into weapons quickly by people who had been practicing the assembly for some time, in locations the council had not yet thought to look for. It was the difference between keeping a weapon under your bed and keeping a workshop in your basement. Sarath Vo had spent 60 years watching the weapon under the bed. He had not looked at the basement. He sat with that for a long time. Through the window, the stars were the same stars, enormous, indifferent. And they did not care what had been built beneath their light, in the rock, in the quiet, by people who kept their books in small drawers and wrote things in cheap pens and asked procedural questions in calm voices and never, not once, showed you exactly what they were preparing for. He reached for his own pen. He thought about what to write. He put it down. He picked up his communication terminal instead and sent a message to Dresch that said only, "Come to my office. Bring the analyst." Then he sat and waited and thought about the folder called If Needed, and thought about what happened when you found the edge of something very large and realized you were standing on it, and had been for a long time, and had mistaken it for flat ground. The war started on a Tuesday. That was not the official record. It's the official record used coordinates and stardate notation and formal language about the Council's enforcement mandate and Earth's failure to comply within the 90-day window. But Dresch, who had been keeping his own notes, wrote it down simply. Tuesday, it started. He had voted against it. He was the only one. The vote was 46-1, and after it was over, Sarath Vo had given him a long look across the chamber floor. Not angry, not contemptuous, just measuring. And Dresch had looked back and thought, "You know I'm right. You're voting yes anyway because 46 votes for a thing is safer than 30, politically, and you are a political creature to your bones." He put the pen in his pocket. He went home. He did not sleep. The first 3 battles were council victories. The human defensive line at Vega Station collapsed in 11 hours. The council's second fleet outnumbered the Earth ships 4-1 and outgunned them by a wider margin than that. The humans had good ships, fast and well built, but not enough of them. And when the exchange became attrition, the numbers ended the argument. The station fell. The humans retreated in an orderly line. The War Committee celebrated with the particular controlled energy of people who had been waiting for permission to be pleased with themselves. Sarath Vo received the reports and marked them as compliant with projected models and said nothing that could be quoted as triumphant, because 400 years had taught him that triumphant statements made before a war was over were the diplomatic equivalent of counting money before the hand was done. He watched the retreat patterns instead. The Meridian Relay fell next. Another orderly retreat. The Earth ships pulled back in formation, tight and disciplined, not running but withdrawing. There was a difference that Sarath Vo felt in his chest but couldn't make his analysts understand when he tried to explain it. Running was chaos. Withdrawing was intention. Running left things behind. The humans left nothing. No wounded, no damaged ships abandoned, no materiel, no data. Every position they gave up was clean when the Council's forces arrived. Equipment stripped or destroyed. Logs wiped. Storage cleared. The Council's intelligence officers walked through fallen human positions and found them emptied of information the way a house was emptied before a sale. Deliberately, thoroughly, uttered by people who knew what they were doing and had time to do it properly. "They knew we were coming," one intelligence officer wrote in her field report. "Every position suggests they had already decided to leave before we arrived." Sarath Vo read that line 6 times. He did not include it in the summary he sent to the War Committee. He kept it in a folder on his own terminal. He called the folder Notes. He was building, without quite meaning to, a private record of everything that did not fit the narrative the War Committee was constructing. The things that were too small to report, the things that felt wrong in the quiet way that wrong things felt wrong before they became obvious. The folder was growing faster than he was comfortable with. The outer moon of Kepler's 62 hours fell in the 3rd week. This one was harder. The Earth forces defending it held for 4 days before pulling back, and they did not make it easy. The Council's 3rd Fleet took serious damage in the approach, losing 6 ships to weapons platforms that had not appeared on any survey data, firing from positions inside the moon's rocky surface that no scan had flagged because they had been built to look, from the outside, like geological formations. When the council's ground teams landed, they found the platforms empty, intact, stripped of their targeting systems and power cores, but otherwise whole, left behind like furniture in a vacated apartment. One of the ground team officers sent back a single-line field note. They left us the hardware. They took the knowledge. Sarath Vo put it in the folder. He called another meeting with Dresh. They sat across from each other in Sarath Vo's office. The two of them, no staff, the door closed, and looked at the map of the conflict on the wall screen. 3 green markers where the council had taken ground. The human forces represented by a line that had moved backward 3 times in 3 weeks, maintaining its shape, never breaking. They're retreating in perfect order, Dresh said. Yes. Every position is prepared for retreat before the battle begins. The evidence suggests that, yes. Dresh looked at the map. When a species is losing a war, their retreat patterns degrade over time. Panic, confusion, units making independent decisions, supply lines breaking down. He paused. This is getting more organized. Sarath Vo did not respond. The first retreat was good, Dresh said. The second was better. Gosh, the third... He stopped. He looked at the Kepler 62F data. The third one planned the weapons platform specifically to delay us long enough for the withdrawal to be clean. They weren't defending that position. They were buying time for something else. What else? Sarath Vo asked. Neither of them had an answer. The answer arrived in the 4th battle. The Council's first fleet entered the Procyon corridor on a Thursday morning. The corridor was a natural lane between 2 star systems, navigable, well-charted, the most direct approach to the human colonial hub at Kepler 296. Taking it would cut Earth's colonial network in half. The War Committee had called it the decisive move, the move that would end the conversation. The fleet entered the corridor in standard formation. 42 ships, and the best armed force the Council had deployed since the border conflict with the Reth 17 years ago. The corridor was narrow. That was the point. It funneled the approach, removed the need to sweep a wide area, let the fleet move fast and hard. It also removed the ability to maneuver sideways. The mines were not mines, technically. The Council's sensor systems read them as debris, because they were debris. Human-manufactured debris, specifically shaped and specifically sized to return the same radar profile as the natural rock and metal fragments that drifted through every major corridor in the galaxy. They were indistinguishable from background noise. They had been placed there over a period of 14 months. The first fleet's lead ships hit them at speed. The detonation sequence took 90 seconds. When it was over, 21 ships were destroyed and 11 were badly damaged. 10 ships made it through the corridor intact. They emerged on the other side and found nothing waiting for them. No human fleet positioned to finish the engagement. No blockade. No trap sprung. Just empty space and a clear path to Kepler 296. They were allowed to continue. They did not continue. The fleet commander, Admiral Shovar, cautious, 200 years of experience, the kind of officer who had survived this long precisely because he trusted wrong feelings, looked at the clear path and the empty space and said to his bridge crew, "We stop here." His bridge crew looked at the empty space. They stopped. The War Committee's response to the Procyon disaster had a specific color that Dresh had learned to recognize over his years in political life. It was the color of people who had been very confident and were now renegotiating their confidence internally while maintaining an external posture of measured reassessment. In plain language, they were frightened and not saying so. He sat in the briefing and listened to the analysts reframe the corridor loss as a tactical setback rather than a strategic revelation. And he thought about the 14 months. The mines had been placed 14 months ago. Work had begun in the corridor 14 months ago. The Council had finalized the decision to deploy the first fleet through the Procyon corridor 11 months ago, in closed session. He thought about the closed sessions. He thought about the first intelligence report and about the communication shift, the encrypted channel, the category called contingency logistics. He thought about the third closed session, the one where they'd decided on the Procyon approach. And he thought about the fact that the mines in the corridor had been placed 3 months before that session. 3 months before the Council had formally decided on the approach The humans had started preparing the corridor to receive them. He went back to his office. He pulled up Earth's colonial administration records. He had access to the public-facing portion of them through the Council's standard diplomatic data sharing agreements, routine administrative documents, budget filings, infrastructure reports. Boring. The kind of material that nobody read carefully because it was specifically designed to be unreadable by people who had better things to do. He had been reading it very carefully for 6 weeks. He found what he was looking for in a budget annex filed 8 years ago by a department called Long-Range Infrastructure Planning. The annex allocated resources for something called corridor maintenance and hazard mitigation in 17 named star lanes. The Procyon corridor was number 4 on the list. The allocation had been renewed annually, without comment, every year for 8 years. He pulled up the full list of 17 corridors. He cross-referenced it against the Council's sealed strategic planning documents, the long-range military approach options that had been modeled and filed over the past 20 years. All 17 corridors appeared on both lists. Every approach route the Council had ever seriously modeled for potential military use. All 17. Maintained. Annually, for 8 years. Hazard mitigation. He put his head in his hands, not from despair. He was not a despairing person. He put his head in his hands the way you did when a very large thing became very clear all at once, and you needed a moment to let your understanding of the world resize itself around the new information. He stayed like that for a while. Then he picked up the pen. He wrote one sentence in his personal notes. They didn't start preparing when the war started. He underlined it. He wrote the next sentence. They started preparing when they met us. He found the original document 3 days later. It was not hidden. That was the part that stayed with him. It was not buried in a secret archive or protected by heavy encryption. It was filed in the standard council membership records, publicly accessible to any council member who wanted to look at 60-year-old administrative paperwork. Earth's original membership application, standard format, 12 sections, unremarkable. The kind of document that archival systems processed automatically and filed without human review. Attached as an appendix, submitted in the same filing format as the supporting administrative documents, the kind of attachment that auto-sorted into the background of any organizational record, was a document. The title was Contingency Planning, Non-Cooperative Membership Scenarios. It was 4,000 pages long. It was dated 3 years before first contact. Dresch sat with that for a long time. Before first contact, before the Council had made formal communication with Earth, before Earth knew what the Council was, what it valued, saw how it operated, whether it was peaceful or hostile or something in the middle. Before they knew any of that, someone on Earth had sat down and written 4,000 pages about what to do if things went wrong. He did not read all 4,000 pages. He read the table of contents and the first 20 pages of the executive summary, and then he stopped because the executive summary was precise and detailed and written in the kind of language that people used when they had thought about something very carefully for a very long time. And reading it felt like looking at a map of a room you were standing in. He went to Sareth Vaux's office. He put the document on the desk. Sareth Vaux read the title. He read the date. The expression on his face was one Dresch had never seen before. 400 years of diplomatic certainty, 6,000 years of council authority behind it, and underneath all of that, something very simple. The expression of a man who had just realized he had been playing a different game than he thought. They were never afraid of us, Dresch said. Sareth Vaux looked at the date on the document. He did not argue. The ceasefire was humanity's idea. This was the part the War Committee found hardest to absorb. In the standard model of these situations, and Sareth Vaux had a standard model for most situations, the losing party requested the ceasefire. They requested it from a position of diminished options. They came with their losses in one hand and their willingness to negotiate in the other. And the negotiation began from that foundation. In the transmission from Earth arrived on a Wednesday morning and opened with, Earth is willing to discuss a temporary cessation of hostilities. We propose neutral ground. We propose the station at Vela 9. We propose next Thursday, as though it were a meeting, as though they were scheduling a working lunch. Sareth Vaux had read the message 4 times before he called the War Committee, and each time he read it, The phrase "next Thursday" did something to his understanding of the situation that he could not fully describe and did not try to. The War Committee agreed. There was not much else to do. The Procyon disaster had quieted the loudest voices, and the quieting of loud voices in a political body had a weight of its own. 47 species in a room, and all of them doing the same private arithmetic. What they had lost, what they still had, what the humans had not yet used, arriving at the same unspoken answer. They agreed to Thursday. The station at Vela 9 was not what Sarath Vo had expected. He had expected something utilitarian. Humans built functional things. They were not, as a species, given to grand architecture. Their council chamber on Earth was a converted industrial building. Their flagship diplomatic station at the edge of their solar system had exposed pipework on the ceiling that no one had ever bothered to cover. They built for purpose, and they fixed what broke, and they did not spend resources on the feeling a room made you have. The negotiation room was functional, clean, well lit. The chairs were the same height. He noticed this immediately. And he had been in thousands of negotiation rooms in his career, and chairs were never an accident. A room where one side sat higher than the other was a room with a predetermined conclusion. A room where the chairs were all the same height was something else. Something that said, before anyone spoke, that what happened next would be decided by what was said, not by who was sitting where. The council delegation arrived first. 47 species reduced to 8 representatives for the session, Sarath Vo at the head, Dresh 2 seats down, 6 others. They waited. The door opened. Admiral Yara Osi walked in. Sarath Vo had read her file the night before. He had read everyone's file the night before. It was the habit of a lifetime, the belief that if you knew who was walking toward you, you were less likely to be surprised by what they said. The file said, 54 years old, born in the Ghanaian coastal city of Accra, raised from age 9 on a mining colony in Jupiter's outer belt, military service beginning at 22, no combat record for the first 15 years, a long period of what the file called infrastructure and logistics coordination that coincided neatly with Dresh's analysis of Project Groundwork's early phases. She had not started as a soldier, she had started as a builder. She wore a field jacket, not a dress uniform. The jacket had no medals. It had a small repair on the left cuff. Fabric slightly different from the rest, the kind of patch job done in a hurry with whatever was at hand. She walked the way people walked when they knew where they were going and had no reason to perform the knowing of it. She sat. She looked around the table at 8 representatives of the Galactic Sovereignty Council. She took out a notepad. She wrote something. Sarath Vo recognized the gesture. He had seen it once before, on a speaker's floor, 60 years ago, before any of this had a name. A different man, the same gesture. He understood, watching her write, that it was not a gesture of indifference. It was not dismissal. It was the notation of something observed, stored, to be reviewed later. She was taking notes on them. He delivered the opening statement. It was the most carefully constructed statement of his 400-year career. He had written it himself, revised it 11 times, now tested it on 3 trusted advisors who had each found nothing to criticize, and delivered it now in the measured, deliberate cadence that 47 species recognized as the voice of consequence. It offered terms, harsh terms, but survivable. Earth would retain autonomy over its internal governance. Its colonial network would remain intact. Military limitations would apply, but the framework was negotiable within a defined range. The outer belt installations would be subject to Joint Council Earth monitoring rather than unilateral dismantling. The Harriet Tubman, he included this carefully, painfully, would be acknowledged in the formal record as a tragic loss for which the Council expressed formal regret. Formal regret, 2 words that cost the Council something and gave Earth a marker for the historical record. He had argued for 20 minutes to include them. It was, he believed, the best offer the Council could make from its current position. It preserved the essential architecture of galactic sovereignty while absorbing the fact of what had happened in the Procyon corridor. It was a controlled outcome, a manageable result. He finished. The chamber was quiet in the way it got when 47 species were all holding the same breath. Osi looked up from her notepad. We're not here to receive terms. The breath did not release. It held somewhere past the point where holding made sense. "We have terms," she said. She slid a document to the center of the table, not across to his side, to the center, equidistant, as though this were a table where things were placed in the middle to be reached for equally. Sarathvo picked it up. Tomari 11 pages. He read the first page. He read the second. He passed it to the representative beside him without speaking and watched it move around the table, each reader's face doing the same careful work of processing something unexpected. The document was not a demand list. It was not a victory declaration. It was not an ultimatum. He noticed this specifically, the absence of the form he knew so well. It was a structural proposal. Earth wanted a permanent seat on the Security Architecture Committee, the council body that approved all military deployments. They wanted veto power over any demonstration of force action against any member or non-member species. They wanted mandatory consultation rights in any decision affecting species with under 200 years of council membership. They wanted, in plain language, Horo to be inside the machinery that made the decisions, not to run the council, not to dissolve it, not to replace it with something else, just to be inside it, with teeth. The document was specific, reasonable, detailed, and clearly the product of people who had thought about council governance architecture for a very long time. Every point cited existing council procedural codes. Every proposed change was framed within the existing legal framework. It was built from the inside, using the council's own structure as its foundation. You could not reject it on legal grounds without dismantling sections of your own procedural code. You could not reject it on moral grounds without admitting you had never intended to share power. You could only accept it, or say no to 11 pages that cost you both options. Dresch read it twice, and he looked at Osei across the table. She was writing something else on her notepad. He had the sudden specific certainty, the kind that arrived fully formed without working through it, that she had written these 11 pages on the transit flight from Earth to Vela 9, that it had taken her less than 2 hours, that somewhere on a server she never referenced in public, there existed a document of considerably more pages, considerably more specific in its consequences, waiting in a folder called If Needed. He thought, she brought the polite version. The silence stretched. It was not the silence of the council chamber, not the engineered silence of a room built to diminish. This was different. And this was the silence that happened when 47 species of intelligent life all arrived at the same realization at the same moment, and none of them had language prepared for it. They had come to receive a surrender. The surrender was not on the table. Sarathvo looked at the document. He looked at Osei. He put the document down. He was 400 years old and he had dissolved 17 civilizations and spent 600 years believing that the arc of galactic history bent toward order, toward the managed, the predictable, the contained. He thought about the closed sessions, the mind corridors, the 14 months, the 4,000 pages dated before first contact, the folder called If Needed, the pen, the market stall vendor who laughed at something that wasn't explainable. He thought about all the things he had not thought to look for. He said, "What happens if we decline?" It was the first time in the negotiation that he had said something he had not prepared. The words arrived from somewhere below the diplomatic training, from the 400-year-old creature underneath the arbitration robes who had recognized, in the last 5 minutes, that he was standing at the edge of something much larger than a ceasefire negotiation, and that the edge had been here for a long time, and he had been walking toward it for 60 years without seeing it. Osei looked up from her notepad. That was all. One sound. The sound a person made when they had considered a question and found it less interesting than the work in front of them. Not dismissive, not threatening, just certain. The silence that followed had a weight no one in the room had felt before. 47 species carrying it. 800 collective years of diplomatic experience around the table, and all of it arriving at the same place. The sound a human admiral made when asked about consequences was more instructive than anything else that had been said in the room. Because she hadn't said you don't want to know. She hadn't said I think you can imagine. She had said the way you said it when someone asked you a question whose answer was already determined, had already been determined, had been determined so long ago that the question itself felt a little late. Dresch picked up his pen. He wrote one word in his notes. He looked at it. He crossed it out. There were no words for what he had just understood that fit on a single line of a notepad. There was only the understanding itself, sitting in his chest like a change in air pressure before weather arrived. The knowledge that the galaxy had just become a different place than it was this morning, and that humanity had not done that today, had not done it in the Procyon corridor, had not done it when the Harriet Tubman burned, had done it 60 years ago or before, in 3 pages of plain language filed under administrative logistics by a man named Arjun Mehta, long dead, who had looked at the kind of galaxy humanity was walking into and written it all down. If things go wrong, here is what we do. Here is what we have already begun to do. Sarathvo looked at the 11 pages. He did not look at Osei again. Yari, we will require 48 hours to review the proposal, he said. It was not a stall. It was the 48 hours a political body needed to arrive, collectively, at a decision that one of them had already arrived at privately. Osei nodded. Of course. She capped her pen. She stood. We'll be at Dock 7. She left the room. Unhurried, shoulders loose, not performing calm, just wearing it. The door closed. The 8 council representatives sat in the room with the equal chairs and the 11 pages, and said nothing for a long time, because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying more clearly. Dresch looked at the center of the table where the document sat. He thought about the pen in his pocket. He thought about the market vendor laughing. He understood the joke now. He did not share it with anyone. The ratification happened on a Friday. No ceremony. A large room, adequate lighting, a table long enough to seat all 47 council representatives and the Earth delegation. Water was available. The translation systems worked. The documents were clean and correctly formatted. Osei signed for Earth. She used the same pen she always used, the cheap one, the kind that cost almost nothing, and passed the document across the table without comment. The council representatives signed in order of seniority. Sarathvo signed last. He held the pen for 3 seconds before putting it to the page. No one who knew him would have called those 3 seconds hesitation. He was not a hesitating man. It was something else. The pause of a person laying down a very long argument that they had been making for 400 years, and understanding in the moment of laying it down how much of themselves had been inside it. He signed. Osei shook the hands she was offered. She shook them with the same straightforward firmness she used for everything. No performance, no warmth performed for the occasion, no coldness either. Just the handshake of a person who respected the person whose hand she was shaking and had things to do afterward. She went back to Dock 7. Her delegation was wheels up by evening. The council chamber was very quiet. 1 year later, Dresch sat in the Security Architecture Committee's first formal session with Earth's permanent representative. The representative was not Osei. It was a man named Dr. Thomas Ayula, a civilian, 60 years old, who had spent his career in policy and governance rather than the military. He was quiet, methodical, and had a habit of arriving at meetings 5 minutes early and spending those 5 minutes reading whatever document was scheduled for discussion with the focused attention of someone who had not read it before, which was confusing because his staff confirmed he always had. He was reading it again. Dresch understood eventually. He was reading it the second time for a different reason than the first time. The first time told him what the document said. The second time told him what the document was doing. The council was proposing a new approach to border enforcement in the outer systems, a joint patrol framework with the Kethan defense brigades, designed to address the growing movement of unregistered ships through the Meridian lanes. It was a straightforward proposal, practical, the kind of thing that had moved through the committee in 20 minutes in the old sessions. Ayula looked up from the document. Which unregistered ships? He asked. The presenting officer from the Kethan delegation said, the survey data shows a pattern of, I've read the survey data, Ayula said. The survey data shows a pattern consistent with commercial traffic from 3 species currently in non-binding trade relationships with council members. None of them have been formally contacted about registration compliance. He set the document down with both hands. Which ships? The presenting officer paused. The proposal is designed to address the general issue of the patrol zones in Appendix C cover the approach lanes to the Yarrow system, Ayula said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He spoke with the same quality that Osei had when she said, the quality of someone who had already followed the argument to its destination and was waiting for everyone else to arrive. The Yarrow are currently in negotiation with 2 council members over resource access rights. A joint patrol presence in their approach lanes during those negotiations would constitute. He waited. The room arrived. The proposal did not pass. It was sent back for revision with specific requirements about scope, transparency, and pre-engagement contact protocols. The Kethan representative argued the revision was excessive. Ayula listened to the argument and agreed with 2 of the 3 points and explained in detail why the 3rd point was not about efficiency, but about the message that a patrol presence sent to a species that had not yet decided whether the council was something worth joining. He did this for the next 8 months. Not arguing, not blocking, asking questions and waiting for the room to arrive. Dresch watched this with the same focused attention he had once given to humans as a species, the attention of someone building a picture from small pieces, each piece individually insignificant, collectively something that changed how you understood the shape of things. He understood, by the 8th month, what was happening. Osei hadn't sent a soldier to the Security Architecture Committee. She had sent a builder. So, 5 years after the ratification, the Vren arrived. They were young, 200 years of spacefaring capability, maybe less. Fast learners, aggressive in the specific way that young spacefaring civilizations were aggressive, which was the aggression of a species that had discovered the vastness of the galaxy and had not yet developed the patience that vastness required. They came to the council station with a demand: territorial expansion rights in 4-star systems currently claimed by council-adjacent species or armed conflict. The old council would have deliberated for 3 months and issued a framework response with 17 points. The Security Architecture Committee convened the next morning. Ayula was in the room. He had arrived 5 minutes early. He was reading the Vren communication for the 2nd time. The committee chairperson, a Veld representative 2 generations junior to Dresch, who had grown up with a different council than the one that had sent ultimatums to Earth, opened the session by asking Ayula if Earth had a preliminary position. Ayula said, "We have a question." The chairperson said, "Go ahead. Has anyone spoken directly to the Vren delegation about what they actually need?" He looked at the communication on the table. The 4 systems they named, 3 of them are resource adjacent to a migration corridor the Vren have been using for 40 years. They're not expanding. They're protecting a route they already consider theirs. The room was quiet. Has anyone told them that the species with adjacent claims don't use those systems heavily? When that a shared access framework is structurally available under existing council codes? He paused. Or did we go straight to treating this as an ultimatum? The chairperson looked at the communication, then at Ayula. The language used is young, Ayula said. The language is young. He put the communication down. We were young once. Someone should go talk to them. The session lasted 40 minutes. The committee approved a direct contact mission to the Vren delegation. Not a response document, not a formal counter-proposal, a conversation. 2 council representatives tasked with sitting across from the Vren and asking them plainly what they needed and what they had. The Vren conflict did not happen. It became instead a negotiated access framework that the Vren signed within 6 weeks and cited, in their formal statement, and as evidence that the council was worth joining. Ayula filed his session notes as he always did. Thorough, specific, organized under clear headings that anyone could find and read without difficulty. He named the section on the Vren Resolution, Standard Contact Protocol, Early Engagement. He filed it as a template for future use. Sirath Vo retired on a gray morning in his 412th year. He submitted the formal resignation through the standard channel. His staff threw a small reception. He received 311 messages from colleagues, former counterparts, species representatives, junior diplomats he had mentored, and 1 unsigned message that said only, "Well done." He did not know who sent the unsigned one. He kept it anyway. Then he spent his last evening on the council station sitting in his office with the lights low, writing his final diplomatic record. He was not required to write it. The formal record was already complete, filed, archived. This was a private document, the kind that came at the end of a very long career, when the official record no longer felt sufficient, and the only way to close a door properly was to say the true thing in a room where no one was listening. He wrote about 17 civilizations. He wrote about the models he had used to understand them, the frameworks he had built, the decisions he had made. He wrote about the distance between what those models had shown him and what had actually been true, and he was honest about this in a way that the official record did not require and would not have permitted. He wrote about Earth. And he wrote about the first closed session, 60 years ago, when the decision to issue the first ultimatum had been made. He had been the lead advocate for it. He had presented the case with certainty. The Soilborns were disruptive, non-compliant, too emotional to be managed through standard diplomatic channels, too stubborn to be absorbed without pressure. He had been persuasive. He had believed what he said. He wrote, "I was measuring the right things. I was missing the right questions." He wrote about the Harriet Tubman. He stopped writing for a while. He wrote, "They budgeted for it. That is the thing I was not able to understand for a long time. They looked at what kind of galaxy they were entering, and they budgeted for everything that could go wrong, including the worst things, and they paid the budget when it came due. And they kept working. That is not something I had a framework for." He wrote about the 11 pages, about Osei's, about Dresch's pen falling on his office floor, about the market vendor on Vela 9 who laughed at something not quite explainable. He wrote, "The joke was not about the pen. I understand this now. I do not fully understand the joke. I think the joke was about us, about the certainty we carried into that market, into those chambers, into 60 years of managing a species we thought we understood. I think the joke was that they could see our certainty from the outside, and it looked from the outside the way overconfidence always looks from the outside, small and temporary, the things we called them." He put the pen down. In the council chamber below his office, the Security Architecture Committee's evening session was still running. He could not hear it from up here. He could see the light in the windows. Ayula was in that room. He had been in that room for 5 years, session after session, asking questions and waiting for rooms to arrive, dismantling bad decisions with the quiet patience of a man who had been built for this specifically, sent here specifically, placed inside the machinery of the council the way the installations had been built inside the rock, in a place where you only found them once you knew to look, and by then they were already part of the structure. He thought about Osei. He thought, she sent a builder. Of course she sent a builder. She had been a builder herself once, before the war. Before the corridor and the session and the 11 pages and the mum. She had spent 15 years building something no one was watching, in the patient and specific way that people built things meant to last. That was what they did. That was what they had always done. They walked into a galaxy that was 6,000 years older than them, looked at it carefully, wrote 4,000 pages in a folder that no one read, and began. Not with soldiers, not with ultimatums, not with demonstrations. With 3 pages of plain language filed under administrative logistics, with a pen that cost almost nothing, with a question asked in a calm voice in a room designed to make you feel small. Which 90-day window? He closed the log. He turned off the light. In the committee room below, Ayula was still at the table. He was asking questions.